Good evening, everybody. I am the other Jay, also known as Zizix, working on the Cyberpunk Red core program. I'm going to walk through some of the changes with the Active Effects branch, and I'm going to do it in two videos. This first one is how I split up the items into a whole bunch of different types and mixins to make the code a little bit more easier to maintain. The intended audience here is other developers of the software. It helps to be a little bit familiar with the code on the dev branch today, which is this January 19th of 2022. So if you were to pull the Active Effects branch and have a look in like an IDE like this one, you'd notice something fairly quickly, which is that in the item folder, there is now a mixins and a types in there. And I want to explain, like, if we look in mixins, you can see there's a bunch of stuff in there. And if we look in types, there's a whole bunch of stuff in here, which you might recognize most of those. Now, if we look in the item code, CPR item.js, I've extended the prepare derived data method. I've overridden it. So this is a method provided by Foundry. We do the usual calling the superclass first, and then we call load mixins, which comes immediately after that, and that's implemented right above. And so what's happening in here is that when mixins, we use this method, get data model templates, to populate this mixins array. And the data model templates come from template.json, which I'll go into in just a moment. But if you remember things like common or physical item or installable, that kind of stuff, those are all templates. So it loads those all up for the item that we are running code from. And then it loops through every one of those templates and calls a mixin on it. And you can see there's a couple of them illustrated there. So keep in mind, in the template.json, when you add a template to an item, it is now going to also add a bunch of code to that item and load it pretty much whenever the item is created on the client side. The prepare derived data, that method is called by Foundry after everything else is put together, after all of the stats and skill, or not really skills, but like all the stats and stuff like that go with the item are figured out. It then calls this method to take some like post creation actions. Let's go look at template.json. And I hope you're sitting down, because when you see what I did to this data model, you might cry. I've hidden the actor portion of this. We're looking at just at items. You'll notice that drug is in there, which I'll get to maybe a little bit later. Here is the list of templates. First up is attackable. You may recall that weapon used to be both a template and a item type, and I basically renamed that to attackable. It's a thing that can attack. I was thinking about having shootable or like attack, like separating that out, but since we treat ranged and melee weapons as the same item type, I figured it makes sense to just have a generic mixin to express that for now. So basically, if it's a weapon, it should be attackable. Common, you're familiar with that kind of stuff already. You might notice that value and like amount and that kind of stuff is now missing. We'll get to that in a moment. The effects mixin is here. This is if an item has effects, and I realize I could call it like effectable if I wanted to be consistent, but I just felt like that was a terrible word. But effects is what grants an item the ability to have active effects on it and put them on the actor. That will be a separate video explaining that one. Equipable, if an item can be equipped, then you can have it cycle through those ownership thing, like ownership or location. You can cycle through locations like owned, carried, or equipped. If it is loadable, that means consume ammo. If it is installable, that means it can be installed into something. This is generally for cyberware, but it is also used for upgradable items and stuff like that too. So installable is a thing that can be installed. The other side of that, like the opposite mixin for that, is upgradable. A thing can be upgraded with things that can be installed. I hope that makes sense. Physical used to be physical item. Now it's just called physical. You'll notice that concealable is now a part of this. And if it is, there's two other flags underneath that to indicate that something is concealable. And if it is, whether or not it is concealed. Stackable is a new one. This is what grants the amount data in there. I'm sorry, property on there. So if you want to have items that can stack on top of each other, like ammo or certain types of gear, you can do that. Valuable is for indicating something that has value. It has a price and a price category. If you're wondering what doesn't have value in this game, the answer is role items and skill items. Most everything else has value associated with it. And then we go into the types. And this stuff is fairly cleaned up because the Mixins do all of the work of extending and providing all the properties that they need. But for type-specific things like armor has stopping power and stuff like that, that is still on the item itself. In general, I tried not to have a mixin that would only apply to exactly one item. I tried to find mixins that applied to more than one for the most part. So if you can imagine, whenever you associate a template with a type of item, it will not only bring with it the data that it needs, but thanks to the mixins, it will now also bring in the code and functionality that might be run as well. And we can take a peek at some of that. So if I go back to the types list over here, you'll see that the ammo actions and stuff like that is now on the ammo type in here. It could be on the loadable type. We could move that, but I like to put it on the ammo one for now. If I go to the loadable one, I'm actually kind of winging this a little bit because I forget what's in the loadable one. There is loading ammunition and setting compatible ammo. So this is all, oh, I remember. So this is all, the ammo has like the decrement and increment parts. Like, so when you discharge the weapon, the code that lowers it or figures out how much it's going to fire is all in this one. But it's generally smaller. Like there's less than 100 lines in this one, and the same is true. Like some of these types, they don't have anything special to them at all. Clothing is another example where there's nothing in here. So you might wonder, why is this here? And it's if we want to do something special or separate for it, like it's easy to extend it so that we could. We can distinguish on just the class name or just the type as well. So instead of having to check the item.data.type, you can just check the object itself, which might be, for some folks, might be a little bit cleaner way to do things. A new one is drug in here, which behaves almost exactly like gear, except that it has a special handling of some active effects, which again, I'll get into in a separate video. You can see like the action in here is snort. So that's basically using a drug, and then you can confirm snorting. The front end doesn't say snort. It's more like consume or something like that. I use a little more friendly language, but I thought snort was funny. And I guess I left that in there. But hopefully you get this walkthrough kind of gives you an understanding of how the code is organized now. For the most part, these guys don't have a lot of code in them. NetArch is the exception. The NetArch has a lot of item-specific code, which is not bad. And programs have, no, it's not programs that do, it's maybe upgrades. Just kidding. I guess the rest of these aren't that bad. The mixins, however, is where a lot of the logic actually exists. So if something is loadable, you can put ammo in it and figure out how unloading or reloading works. If it's physical, the concealing code, set something concealed or unconcealed, you can do that. Stackable, like setting item amounts, is in there. Upgradable has a lot of code in here too for handling the installation and uninstallation of upgradable items. And value has a couple of like calculating a price, like a convenience function for, or convenience method rather, for calculating the category that goes with it. And that's it as far as this is concerned. If you are wondering how we've hooked up multiple item types to have their own objects in Foundry, you can get to that in this entity factory. This used to be called actor factory. And I basically used the same trick as before, where there is now a proxy object in here that you can see it right here. It is this return new proxy. It's basically, I associate the proxy object with the base entity that Foundry understands for items. But when you call it with something, instead of it returning the proxy object, it returns a more specific item type on its behalf. So this proxy call gets one of these strings in here, like ammo or armor or something like that, and it returns the class that it should have, that Foundry then goes ahead and instantiates and populates all the data and does all the right things. Once it's done populating the data, like I mentioned earlier, you may recall the load mixins call gets called. and then that's what adds all of the functions that it should know about to the object as well. So you can think of Mixins as a way to like inject classes into the hierarchy for the object. And that's it. So hopefully that's not too confusing. Fairly extensible. You can do a lot of, we can add more mixins, we can add more types fairly easily. So there's a lot of opportunity there if you want to get crazy with things. One thing that I was thinking about in the future was associating actions with mixins. So like if something is attackable, then therefore you can attack with it and deal damage with it. If it's reloadable, then you can, associate those reload or change ammo glyphs with it. I didn't get that far. At some point, I just had to make this merge request happen. So, but it's something that I'm thinking about. I might introduce as a separate merge request in the future. So that's that. I'm going to check out the second video on active effects where I get deeper into how that's all implemented.